He called fire down from the sky. He faced 450 enemies alone and won. He ended a 3-year drought with a single prayer. By any measure, this was the greatest day in his entire life. And then, within 24 hours, he sat down in the desert and asked God to let him die. What happened to Elijah in those 24 hours? Why did the man who feared no army completely fall apart after his greatest victory? The answer is in the Bible, but most people read right past it. His name was Elijah, and in ancient Israel, that name meant trouble for kings, for priests, and for anyone who chose the wrong side. We find his story in the first book of Kings, chapters 17 through 19. Elijah was a prophet from a small town called Tishbe. He had no army, no palace, no political allies. What he had was a message and the courage to deliver it to the most powerful man in Israel. That man was King Ahab, and beside Ahab stood his wife, Jezebel, a Phoenician princess who had brought her gods with her when she crossed the border. Her god was Baal, and in the years since her arrival, the worship of Baal had not just entered Israel, it had taken over. Jezebel had organized something that looked very much like a religious purge. The prophets of God were being hunted. Many were already dead. The ones still alive were hiding in caves, kept alive in secret by a brave official named Obadiah. Into this climate, Elijah arrived and declared a drought. No rain, no dew. Until he said otherwise. For 3 years, the land dried up. Crops failed, people went hungry, and the tension between Elijah and the royal court reached a breaking point. So Elijah issued a challenge. He called every prophet of Baal to Mount Carmel, 450 of them against one man. The test was simple. Whichever God answered with fire would be the real God. The prophets of Baal went first. They prayed for hours. They shouted. They danced. Nothing happened. Then Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt an altar, drenched it in water 3 times, and prayed one quiet prayer. Fire fell from the sky and consumed everything. The offering, the wood, the stones, even the water in the trench. The crowd fell on their faces. The prophets of Baal were defeated. Then the rain came back after 3 years of silence. And Elijah, filled with an energy that the text describes as almost supernatural, outran the king's chariot all the way back to Jezreel. It was his greatest day, the moment everything had been building toward. And then Jezebel sent him a message. To understand what happened next, we need to understand what kind of woman sent that message. It was around 860 BCE, during the reign of the Omride dynasty in northern Israel. This was a powerful kingdom, wealthier and more internationally connected than Israel had been in generations. King Ahab had built an ivory palace. He had trade deals with Phoenicia sealed by his marriage to Jezebel. But Jezebel was not simply a foreign wife who brought her religion with her. Historians and biblical scholars note that she operated as a political force in her own right. She had already eliminated most of Elijah's prophetic network before the Mount Carmel confrontation even took place. This was not impulsive anger. This was organized suppression. Archaeological evidence supports the picture the Bible paints of this era. Inscriptions from the period confirm the deep Phoenician cultural influence on northern Israel. The site of Mount Carmel itself has been venerated for thousands of years, with ancient Greek and Hebrew inscriptions found in caves there, showing that people remembered and honored what happened on that ridge for millennia. When Elijah fled, he ran south, past his hometown, deep into the Negev desert, and eventually all the way to Mount Horeb, also known as Sinai. That journey covered hundreds of kilometers and took 40 days. The Bible makes this parallel deliberately. Moses had gone to the same mountain. The same God had met him there. Now Elijah was retracing those sacred steps, not as a conqueror, but as a broken man. This is not just geography. This is the biblical author telling us what is about to happen here is a founding moment, a crisis at the center of everything. Here is what makes this story so deeply strange. Elijah had just performed the greatest miracle of his ministry. He had publicly defeated the most powerful religious machine in the kingdom. And Jezebel's message, one message, no soldiers, no immediate action, made him run for his life. He didn't just leave. He left his servant behind. He walked alone into the desert, sat under a single broom tree, and said, "It is enough. Take away my life. I am no better than my fathers." He wanted to die. Some scholars read this as a purely spiritual moment, a prophet overwhelmed by the magnitude of God's calling, humbled to the point of surrender, a crisis of unworthiness, not weakness. Under this reading, the collapse is the necessary ending of Elijah's self-reliance before God could use him in a deeper way. Others, applying historical and literary analysis, point out something subtle in the text. Elijah repeats the same phrase, "I am the only one left," twice in two different conversations with God. Even after a powerful theophany, he heard the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. He heard the still, small voice, and then he said exactly the same thing again. Some scholars suggest this repetition is deliberate. The author is showing us a man who cannot be reached by spectacle. His mind is locked. A third interpretation has emerged more recently from the intersection of psychology and biblical studies. Researchers note that Elijah's behavior in 1 Kings 19 matches a specific pattern: exhaustion after extreme effort, withdrawal from relationships, a distorted belief that he is completely alone, and a wish for it all to end. His isolation was not random. He sent his last companion away before the worst moment. He made sure no one was watching. What happened to Elijah after his greatest victory may not be a mystery of faith. It may be a very human story about what happens when a person gives everything they have and finds that victory feels like emptiness. Modern psychology has a name for what Elijah experienced. It's called burnout, specifically the kind that follows extreme performance. When a person pushes past their limits for a long time, the mind and body run on stress hormones. There is a kind of driven energy that carries people through impossible situations. But when the crisis ends, that energy crashes, and the silence that follows a great victory can feel more unbearable than the battle itself. Researchers who have studied Elijah's narrative specifically note that his symptoms align with what psychologists call a major depressive episode: hopelessness, exhaustion, social withdrawal, cognitive distortion. That last one is especially visible in the text. A cognitive distortion is when the mind tells us something that feels completely true but is factually wrong. Elijah was certain he was the only faithful person left in Israel. God's response: there were 7,000 others, 7,000, and Elijah could not see a single one. This doesn't make Elijah weak. It makes him human. It makes him recognizable. Many people who work tirelessly for something they believe in, whether in ministry, medicine, social work, or any field that demands deep personal investment, reach a moment where they feel completely alone, completely spent, and invisible to the very God they served. What God did next is remarkable, and it says nothing about theology. God did not rebuke Elijah, did not correct his doctrine, did not demand he return to work. Instead, food, rest, more food, more rest, then movement, then a question spoken quietly: "What are you doing here?" Not an accusation, an invitation. Elijah never fully returned to what he was before. He anointed a successor, handed over his mission, and eventually left the world in a whirlwind, one of only 2 people in all of Scripture who never died. But here is what stays with us. The man who asked God to end his life was chosen to appear, centuries later, beside Moses at the transfiguration of Jesus. The most broken prophet became one of the most honored figures in all of sacred history. Maybe the Bible keeps this story not to explain burnout or to give us a clinical framework. Maybe it keeps this story because it is true in the deepest sense. Because every person who has ever poured themselves into something sacred and found themselves empty on the other side deserves to know that someone, somewhere, already felt exactly this way. And the first response was not a sermon, it was a meal. If these ancient stories move you, if you believe that real history, real psychology, and real faith belong in the same conversation, then you are exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe to Éden Unsolved and join us every week as we go deeper into the stories most people never stop to question. And if this episode made you think, leave a like. It helps more people find their way here.